Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special series from the Elite City podcast. I'm joined by Jay and Biddy and Blasco here today.
Nope.
Hey guys.
Hello.
As you probably know, that's the April 16th episode of Dynamite, which they're calling Spring Breakthrough. It's a celebration of AEW Dynamite passing WCW Nitro, or as they can say on TV, becoming the longest running weekly primetime pro wrestling show in Turner sports history. To make
That's
it
amazing.
Specific, because they can't say Nitro. So
that's incredible.
I
love it.
Let's start with that. How do you guys feel about Dynamite passing Nitro? For me, it seems crazy because Nitro was like Nitro seemed like it was on forever.
That's what I was just gonna say. Nitro seemed like it was on for 4,000 years, but I'm happy that something's beating it. I mean, just because, like, nothing against WCW or Bischoff or whatever, or Turner, but it's just happy. I'm just happy that something's being successful.
Yeah, I agree. On that note, we're going to do a series. So this is part of our series. The first part, we'll be looking at how AEW was born. And that means looking back at the wrestling world. And we figure looking back to around 2001, which is when WCW and ECW both shut down. So for this part, we're going to be focusing on about 2001 until about 2013. So we're going to start with a little timeline here. So it makes, like I said, it makes sense to start with when WWF at the time bought WCW in March 2001. 2001.
It's absurd.
Were you guys watching in 2001 when that happened?
Yes.
No.
All right, everyone. Thanks a lot.
I don't think so. I don't think so. When did SmackDown come about?
That was like 99.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it was 99.
No. Yeah, it was in the 90s for sure.
I feel like I'm looking that shit up.
I didn't have cable television, so that wasn't an option for me. We had whatever came in on the old antenna.
Old antenna.
I watched.
I did. My parents' friends' kids had the old. You remember the N64 games for WCW and all that? We played those for hours and hours and hours. I didn't know who anybody was. I just picked like the coolest looking wrestler at the time, and that's pretty much my knowledge base of WCW.
It certainly was a high time for wrestling. Sorry, go ahead, Biddy.
SmackDown was 1999.
I see. I told you. I don't know anything about what I did like this morning, but if you ask me about wrestling from 25 years ago, I'm down. I know. I'm purposely put a document in front of my screen so that I can't see what you guys are doing. Blasco, you were watching back then. I know you were.
100%. This is where I learned some stuff, which I thought all this happened way later. My timeline was skewed. And you said they bought WCW in 01?
Yeah. March 2001. It was right before WrestleMania 17.
Okay. Well, this is nuts because I was going to say it was right around when I got hired at the mill. I got hired in March of 01. So this is where I skewed everything. I was watching then, but I would be watching via, like, I'd record everything. So it's also when I started to fall off.
On VHS?
VHS, 100%.
Yes.
On your VCR.
100%.
Yeah. So it was like I noticed like around late 01 or early 02, I'd be fast forwarding through like 95% of the show. But I can honestly WWE Raw. Once they bought them, like that was the fall off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I watched I would always watch Nitro even in high school on delay. Like I'd always record it because I'd watch Raw live. But yeah, I didn't realize that I thought that was all in my mind. That was all like way earlier. But yeah, I started to fall off around 02, and then it was around late 03 that I was totally done with WWE, and that's when I started to I would read the magazines a lot, and I would kind of tool around on the internet. Like I would read the stuff, but like video was hard to come by. But like I remember like reading results for like stuff happening in Mexico and Japan and having no idea what I was reading, but it was interesting and it was pro wrestling related.
And you also watched ECW, right? I didn't watch.
Yes.
I was in a weird situation because Canada didn't get a lot of this stuff. We got Nitro like on a weird, like it didn't air at the same time as Raw. It aired like Tuesday at 11 o'clock or something. Like it was like a weird thing. It didn't start airing at a better time zone until Bret Hart went there. And we didn't get ECW until it ended up on that TNN show that they had.
Now, so once it was on TNN, like it was everywhere, obviously, but being on the East Coast, we got it in Pittsburgh, but it was on at like Saturday at like, it was either like 2:30 or 3:30 in the morning. And we would always stay up to watch it because it was the most absurd. Like those early ECW shows couldn't even be on television at 2:30 in the morning today. Like
was it on like a weird channel?
It was on the local Pittsburgh channel called UPN.
Okay, I've heard of UPN.
I think they
fair,
ran Penn's games for a while.
UPN was in a lot of markets at that time. They had some really
UPN didn't SmackDown start there? I think
possibly.
It did. I think SmackDown started on UPN.
Wait, I think I still have the Wikipedia open.
I think Rick's right.
SmackDown started on UPN. I remember that.
It was on UPN at one time.
It was, yep.
There you go. Yeah.
Wait, SmackDown debuted in
its first
Kansas
show, I think,
City on UPN.
Yeah, there you go.
April 29th, 1999.
There you go.
So yeah, like that's what ECW was on. So I watched all that. Like I bet you I would say 90% of the ECW shows that were once it was Extreme Championship Wrestling, like when it was still Eastern Championship Wrestling, it was on, but I didn't care about it. Once it became Extreme, it was all over.
So when they both shut down, when WCW and ECW both shut down, what did you think?
I was done. It was it.
Yeah.
Like
I was like,
I
was one of those WWE now. I was one of those fans that's like, because I was young and I only had access to WWF.
Right.
I was one of those fans who was like, everything else sucks. One of those people who I would hate today. But at the time, I was just like, oh, this is awesome. Like, I hated WCW. So I'm like, yeah, that's awesome that he bought WCW. It's awesome that ECW. And then even I, as a hardcore, like, WWF loyalist at the time, once they brought WCW and ECW in and they kind of just trashed them, even I, who never watched those companies, was like, this kind of sucks. Like, this is...
Yeah.
And so while I was planning this episode, I looked this up. And but the reason we're talking about this is because part of the birth of AEW is the end of all the other companies and the lapsed wrestling fans and people who stopped watching. And by lapsed wrestling fans, I was thinking by the end of the Monday Night Wars, I looked this up, depending on the week, about 6 or 7 million people are watching Raw by the end, by like late 2000, early 2001.
Okay.
And about, even at its worst, I mean, 3 or 4, sometimes 2, but usually 3 or 4 million people are watching Nitro on an average.
Insane. And that was considered bad.
Yeah, that was like they were tanking. The company was like failing.
Yeah.
When Nitro ended, the Raw's 52-week average was about 6.5 million people. And then if you look at the charts, I sent you guys this chart.
Yes.
Right around that time when Nitro ended, Raw's ratings started just dropping and dropping and dropping. It was a steadily drop. Like, it's a pretty consistent drop down. So it's not like those 3 million people who are watching WCW or however many people are watching ECW. It's not like they then started watching Raw. If anything, people stopped watching Raw after they shut down. And I mean, that's us, right? Even as a hardcore WWF fan, I stopped watching. Like, not stopped watching, but I stopped caring as much. I remember thinking the invasion would be like the greatest thing that they could ever possibly do. And it was so bad that, like, as an annoying teenager who loved WWF, was just like, this sucks. I want to see more WCW guys. And I didn't even like the WCW guys because I didn't know them. But, like, I knew, like, Booker T and DDP. I knew all those people. And I was just like, why are they just like, why do they look like losers? Like, I've seen them on other shows and they didn't look like losers. Like, this was on purpose. This was Vince McMahon going, I bought everyone and I'm going to make them all look like losers.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's so bad.
So on that note, I talked about it. Blasco talked about it. Both you, Jay, and Biddy watched WWF or WWE at some point. What made you stop watching them? Because that's a part of the AEW story is people stopped watching WWE.
So I'm sure I've talked about my journey of wrestling, but in what year was it? 1998. I moved back home with my mom and stepdad, and my stepdad was really into WWF. And so we sat down and watched Raw every single Monday night. And I had as a kid, watched some wrestling stuff, blah blah blah, but never watched it regularly. And that was the first time we did. And we all as a family got really into it. Now, to be fair, this was when Mae Young gave birth to a hand and the Rock and Sock connection and the entire, the Attitude Era at its height. And
I used to watch wrestling with my family and my grandma. I think I mentioned this before. My grandma was started watching it, like she got me into it. And then by that point, she was like, I'm not watching this. Like, I'm not watching like, people give birth to a hand. That's it for me.
I mean, it was ridiculous, but we all cracked up. Like,
Oh, yeah, I loved it.
yeah.
Not that specific angle, but the shows.
But yeah, so I want to say like the first year and a half I moved back with my mom and stepdad, we watched it religiously, and then I'm not quite sure what happened. We just stopped. It was not long after SmackDown premiered. We watched the first like couple episodes or whatever, but it would seem like having 2 nights of that was too much, and I don't know, it just dissolved. Plus I became a moody teenager and blah blah blah. So that's basically all I have to
that is around the time a lot of people stopped watching. Like 2000, 2001 was a lot of time a lot of people stopped watching. Jay was never watching at this point, so I'm not being rude by skipping over you. I'm just skipping over you.
No, I mean, like, UPN only came in if the weather was good. I know if you're under 30 on this listening to this, you're not going to understand what I mean.
I mean, that's a thing that we kind of have to mention. Like, we're going to talk about a bunch of other companies that came out.
Yeah,
this,
and
right?
I mean, we had like 8 channels that came in, and most of them were like networks like Fox, CBS, NBC, and then like some public TV, like public broadcast, like PBS, like Pittsburgh and stuff. And that's pretty much what I watched on TV all the time because that's all there was. I mean, like cable wasn't even on our road. This is like, the 90s and the early 2000s. Like it just didn't exist, and satellite was outrageous. So
I mean, like that's a relevant point for the time came in. We're going to talk about the time frame that came after that. So the 2001 was when ECW and WCW shut down. 2002, WWF became WWE. They'll say it was because they wanted to streamline and talk about. No, it's because they lost the lawsuit. It's nothing.
They definitely. I remember, like as a kid, having those like World Wildlife Fund free books that you got for things, and I was always like, "That's kind of funny that it's the same name, like WWF." Yeah.
I'm not going to make this a whole thing, but first of all, I love that now they act like, no, we did that on purpose because we wanted to. No, you didn't. There was no way.
No,
and I love that they had a deal with the World Wildlife Fund to both share the initials, as long as they didn't primarily market themselves as WWF. They still called themselves primarily World Wrestling Federation. And of course, Vince McMahon was like, I can do whatever I want. I'm going to make it. And then they're like, no, actually, you can't. There are laws.
No.
Anyway, in the time frame after WWF became WWE, they started their ruthless aggression era. Around that same time, 2002, also a few other companies opened up. Combat Zone Wrestling, CZW.
Hell yeah.
Started as I never watched them at all, but it started to feel like a hardcore the niche that ECW once had.
Alaska's going hell yeah, and I'm like, I never even heard of that until today.
That's where Mox came from.
That's where Mox came from. That's the only reason I know it exists.
I know it because that's where Mox came from. He got the fake chainsaw to the forehead.
Yeah, that's the only reason. Did you ever watch it?
Yes, that's what got us back into wrestling. Well, this is a funny story. We used to.
Why did you refer to yourself as us?
My group of friends.
Oh, okay.
Like
He's
not like we.
royalty.
Yes.
I
He's
thought
royalty.
you were.
No,
royalty.
no. Like we have watched wrestling since we were 4 years old, and still to this day do. Anyways, we used to do Royal Rumble Power Hours on YouTube. So if you're not aware what a power hour is, you have to take a shot of beer every 60 seconds for one whole hour. It sounds like, oh, that's not a lot, but it is when you're actually doing it the correct way. So we involved Royal Rumble and turned it into a drinking game. So we would throw all old Royal Rumbles on. We had all these crazy rules, like if the person that came to the ring is dead, you had to chug, which that rule got changed really fast because you didn't realize how many people were actually dead in Royal Rumbles. But anyways, so from that, our YouTube started to show us like crazy wrestling from like Japan and stuff. So we got into all the like the deathmatch stuff that we always wanted to watch from the 90s. And then CZW started, and they took to YouTube very well. And oh, it was incredible. That was the first time I saw the trampoline with no trampoline on it, and they just filled the springs with barbed wire, and people were getting power bombed onto that and then bouncing. It was incredible.
That sounds like
just
a Mox company for sure.
Oh, dude, it was nuts. There's a video if you want to watch it. A guy gets a weed whacker to the throat while like it's like on, like he pulls. It's gas powered too. Absolutely incredible.
I don't want to watch that.
Absolutely incredible stuff. They were insane. But yeah, we would watch their videos and just like be blown away that like people would pay to go see that, and then we were like, we want to go pay to see that, and it never came here.
But you weren't watching that in like 2002. That was later.
Well, when did YouTube start? So I'm maybe 05.
When did probably around then.
So yeah, 05.
2004 is when YouTube started.
Okay, so we'll say 05 because it wasn't like at the beginning. But
but
to tell you how long ago it was on Xbox 360. There wasn't even an app. We would go to YouTube through the browser. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So it was on Xbox 360. Yeah, that's where we CZW and all that. And
I'm really glad we have an old person audience because we've mentioned VHS. We've mentioned the creation of YouTube.
Yeah. Well, that's where like once I understood what YouTube was, that's where I watched everything that I always wanted to watch from high school. Like I've watched King of the Deathmatch tournament 95 about 70 times in my life over YouTube.
And back then they didn't have like copyrights. Like you could just put anything on YouTube. They didn't care.
Right.
So, yeah.
So man, it was like the Wild West, but so much awesome wrestling was on there. And then we used to follow these guys that were backyarders that were like in their 30s. Utterly incredible stuff. Very, very serious. And we just made fun of them over and over and over for many years.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Also around this time,
yes,
TNA still exists. Total Nonstop Action, founded by Jeff Jarrett, 2002. They started with weekly $9.99 pay-per-views instead of a TV show.
Was a genius idea.
Yeah, because like we've kind of alluded to it, but like the reality at the time was there was a limited number of networks and an even smaller number of channels that like most people would get. Right, there was not that many, and the internet, like we said, YouTube was like in 2004, 2005. So in 2002, if you had no other choice, like if one of the 10 channels that most people had, 20, that's it. You just weren't on TV, right? Yeah. So it made sense. I never watched the TNA. I followed TNA more than any of these other companies that we've talked about or will talk about. I never ordered the weekly ones, but I know one time it was like their first anniversary or something like that. They had a best of TNA. It was like $1 or something on pay-per-view. And it was like the best of their first year. And I remember watching that, and like the stuff you read on the internet made it seem like it's a bunch of guys you've never heard of and a couple of like ex-WWE guys. And it didn't seem, but like when you watched it, it was pretty innovative. They did stuff that like WWE wasn't doing, not in terms of violence, but in terms of, high flyers, in terms of cruiserweights, in terms of, bigger risks, stuff like that.
Wasn't their claim to fame I don't want to get it wrong, the X division?
Yeah, the X division. And it was like,
okay.
It was a cruiserweight division, but it wasn't a cruiserweight division. Like the slogan was, it's not about weight limits, it's about no limits. And it was just it was kind of weird because they didn't have a rule as to what it was. It was just, are these matches are going to be more acrobatic, more high.
Oh, okay.
In kayfabe, that doesn't really make sense because why would these matches be any different? But like,
right.
Thing. So that was pretty cool. When all the other companies shut down, it seemed like they kind of wrestling splintered out, right? Like the hardcore group was CZW, and then the high flyer group was TNA, and then the technical group was another company that technically still exists, is Ring of Honor.
Yeah.
And I know you watched more Ring of Honor than anything.
Heck yeah.
Any of these other companies. So that was 2002, around the same time TNA launched. And they launched in 2003, they introduced the Code of Honor, which emphasized sportsmanship, match quality, things like that. And they kind of became the technical wrestling home, did they not?
Yes. Yeah, that was what it is today. It's the Japanese style of wrestling. And it wasn't from the very beginning, but it was pretty close when I started to watch it. Like, we're not going to tell anybody, but I used to bootleg them via the interwebs on the torrents because they weren't on our cable. But once we got them, that was a whole new, obviously, it's not real, but when you see matches for the first time, like, it'd be like if you watched WWE your whole life and you turn to AEW on today and you're like, right. Oh my God, that's different. Like, I was blown away at everything, the physicality, the actually caring about wrestling holds in a pro wrestling match, like making it look real. I know that sounds bad, but like an arm bar looked better in Ring of Honor than it did in WWE.
Yeah,
that makes
it's like how I always talked about Bret Hart. Bret Hart didn't look like he was really in a fight because he was doing wrestling holds and like that you wouldn't do that in a fight. But he looked like the holds he was doing would hurt you if he did.
Yes, and that was Ring of Honor, and just some of the cool stuff, like seeing people turn into who they are, like seeing Danielson, then Kevin Steen, then Steve Corino was still wrestling. Their big stable was called Scum. I forget what it stood for. Something Ultimate Mayhem. But they were so awesome.
I know the first time I heard about them was Samoa Joe and CM Punk. That's the first time I actually heard about.
Oh, yeah, and then how do you leave out that? Jeez. Just their trilogy. If you've never watched their trilogy, go watch Joe and Punk's trilogy. It's amazing.
And around the same time, I didn't watch it. I didn't even know it existed. It's like CZW for me. But Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, PWG, had its first show in 2003. Wow. I did not know anything about them.
I did know of this company. I'm going to really date us again here. So back in the day on MySpace, I had CM Punk in my top 8, and he was currently with this company. And that's how I found out about CM Punk. And I was a teen girl and all that jazz, as the baby of our group here. And I was like, whoa, who's that hottie? And now I'm like, wow, I hate that guy so much.
Love that we've so far mentioned Antenna, VHS recording,
correct.
MySpace.
He was in my top 8.
Well,
I was like, I'm cool.
This is what
how it was
for us.
It was, yeah. And then so like CM Punk, you remember the message boards on MySpace? This is how I like kind of started to learn about wrestling.
Nice.
was through MySpace, because he had like posted stuff, and then there was other people that like popped up to how it was social networking back then. It was, now you're like, ooh, I don't who is that person,
now you just get people screaming at you. Yeah It was so
it was so nice back in the day.
It was. That's how these companies kind of survived or got big, was through like early usage of the internet, right? Like people didn't
100%.
like
message boards,
Yeah.
forums. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't watch most of this stuff, but that's how I heard about this stuff. That's how I knew who Samoa Joe was, or Christopher Daniels. People like I knew of them through like message boards on the internet, just people talking about it. That's how I first knew who Bryan Danielson was, when I heard people were talking about him online. That's how this stuff happened at the time. Like you couldn't just find any wrestling you ever wanted easily,
No.
like you can
Well,
now.
I still to this day will find random things that like, oh, I wanted to watch that in high school, and I'll look it up and be like, yes, finally, after
Yeah.
40 years. Like, well, if you want good quality matches, follow Eddie Kingston and just watch any match he posts.
Oh yeah, sometimes he shares stuff from Japan, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And 9 times out of 10, it's like, oh my God, I remember reading about that. Like, and it's, if you're a nerd, you'll appreciate it.
It was around 2004 that things started taking off kind of for all these companies. There was a fallout with in ROH. Their founder, Rob Feinstein, did things that weren't appropriate or legal, and left ROH. And that caused, up until that point, TNA and ROH kind of shared talent between each other. And after that point, TNA decided that if you're going to be on a TNA show, you can't be on an ROH show, and vice versa. Which kind of split things. I remember CM Punk's documentary ad from WWE. He was one of the few who stayed with ROH, and a lot of the people went to TNA because it was a bigger company.
Yeah,
and it paid more, I'm assuming. So guys like AJ Styles, Christopher Daniels, Samoa Joe, they became kind of the mainstays of TNA, and that launched TNA into a couple things. First, they ended their weekly pay-per-view model because they got a show on Fox Sports Net first, and then they eventually moved to Spike TV. They also introduced monthly pay-per-views, so they were like a wrestling company at this point.
Right.
They had a weekly TV show, they had monthly pay-per-views. They were obviously not WWE, but they were a wrestling like a wrestling company, as if you would know a wrestling company today.
Mm-hmm.
I remember specifically Christian Cage and later Kurt Angle joining TNA, and that was huge. Like those were absolute massive moves for them.
It wasn't Christian their champion?
Yeah. Oh. Christian was a huge move because he willingly left. Like Kurt Angle got released, and a lot, even today, like a lot of wrestlers who go from one company to another do that because they got released, right? They get released, they go to another company. Christian had an angle with John Cena at the time, and it was getting over, and people were super into Christian, and Vince always hated Christian, so he didn't like this. So there was supposed to be a one-on-one match with Christian and John Cena, and Vince was like, oh, that's not going to draw. Let's put Chris Jericho in, make it a triple threat match. And Christian was like, no, it is going to draw. You can see when I come out, people react to me, people like me. And Vince is like, no, you have to have Chris Jericho with you. It's not going to work. So anyway, Christian.
Side note, when you look at Edge and Christian, and you choose Edge over Christian, I just don't get it. You know what?
And Vince specifically hated Christian's face, apparently.
Yeah, he said that. Yeah, I'm just like, well, this is why you don't let men decide this,
and especially not Vince McMahon.
Well, yeah.
I just don't understand how somebody's athleticism depicts how they look,
because it's Vince McMahon.
Well, right. I mean, just think of the insanity of that. It's like, oh, you're really good at what you do, but I personally think you're not good looking. So
yeah, it's Vince McMahon. That's Vince McMahon.
Right.
I was gonna say, that just sounds like Vince McMahon.
Well,
yeah,
both of them should have felt icky for that, but like, ooh, gross.
But
wrestling.
He was one of the first and one of the only, I believe, who was just like, well, fine, there's another company now. I don't have to just put up with you. And he left, which was pretty cool because TNA was a company, like it existed. It had pay-per-views, it had a TV show, but it wasn't WWE. It was a risk for him to, it wasn't like going from WCW to WWE or WCW to or WWF after WCW. Like TNA was much smaller, but it was a company, right? So he left, and that was a big deal. And then Kurt Angle, they tried to make him stop wrestling as much because he was addicted to painkillers. And Kurt Angle decided, no, I'm just going to take the painkillers and go to TNA, which even now he'll say that was a bad decision.
Yeah.
But it was pretty cool when he went to TNA, because I remember him going to TNA. It was one of the first like things that I saw online and then could immediately watch the video for. I think it was 2005, and it probably was YouTube, because I remember hearing Kurt Angle went to TNA and being, oh, I have to look that up, and then being able to see it, as opposed to a lot of the things you had to hear about. And he immediately started a feud with Samoa Joe that was awesome. Like they were so good.
You know, they say not all men are created equal, Rick.
Is this a Scott Steiner line?
You look
I'm
at
assuming it
me
is.
and you look at Samoa Joe.
I mean, that was why TNA was kind of the downfall of TNA, to be honest, when they brought in like the Scott Steiners and then eventually the Hulk Hogans.
So bad.
And because
It
they
was
became
so
what
bad.
they eventually became what WCW became, where they're like, if you ever worked in WWF or WWE, we were going to hire you and put you in the main event, which obviously not a great idea. But I mean, they did become a 2-hour show. They became pretty successful on Spike TV. They became successful to the point that, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead in our timeline and I'll go back to it later. They eventually signed Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff, which was especially in retrospect, but also at the time, bad idea.
100%.
In 2009, and then Derek Bischoff decided, you know what we should do? Let's go head to head with Raw on Monday nights. Terrible idea. Because their first show was like, oh, we're going to have Hulk Hogan on our first show. And WWE at the time was like, you know how Bret Hart hasn't been here in 15 years? We're just going to bring him back. And they immediately crushed them. And they sent them back to Thursdays pretty shortly afterwards. So that was not, I mean, say what you want about Vince McMahon, and we certainly do. But I mean, if you have Bret Hart returning to the company and you can just throw that on a Raw to squish your competition, I mean, you will.
That was probably the last Raw that I've like watched.
I remember watching that one live because I'd moved out by that point. I was living with my now wife, then wife actually. Then wife. And we didn't have cable. We just had internet. And I remember, we did have cable, but we rarely watched it. And she wasn't going to sit there for 2 hours every Monday and watch Raw with me. But I remember that show, Bret Hart was going to come back.
Wow,
and
imagine that.
And I remember I watched that one. I hadn't been watching a lot, but I watched that one.
Yeah, I watched that one too.
But part of the reason I wasn't watching.
Shower.
Part of the reason I'm going to just talk over Biddy. Part of the reason I wasn't watching at the time was probably a reason that a lot of people stopped watching WWE, if you hadn't stopped already, was all the Chris Benoit situation. And that affected everything. If you weren't watching wrestling at the time, you don't know how much it affected wrestling because it was obviously awful. True. And they implemented a wellness policy following that. And you can say how successful that wellness policy is. I don't know, but they did, and they tried. They also went PG after that because they were like, oh, we look really bad doing all the stuff we're doing. And if someone tunes in and we're, because the Ruthless Aggression era was for everything that the Attitude Era was. The Ruthless Aggression era was like, hey, how about if we didn't have any of the stories or any of the interesting things, and instead we just had like naked women on TV, and then we hit people in the head with stuff. Like, there's no reason for any of it. Then just going to do it. Like, they went significantly farther than the Attitude Era did for significantly less effect. And then they ended up going PG because of everything that happened to them. And that's a lot of people tuned out. I don't think they tuned out because it went PG. I didn't. I tuned out because like the Benoit stuff just made you kind of icky, where like they had a situation where they had a wrestler who could do that and probably knew that he was in a situation where maybe he wouldn't do that, but they knew he wasn't the healthiest guy.
Yeah, right.
And just kind of were fine with it as long as he wrestled matches. So yeah, that's part of the if we were all talking about why we stopped watching, that's one of the reasons I stopped watching. Like, I moved out, I had a wife, but also like, I don't want to watch this. Like, this is kind of gross. And it was one of the times where you always knew Vince McMahon was an awful person, but like, he was an awful person. And every single thing that came out that like, oh yeah, he was actually way worse than I thought he was. And this is one of those where you're just like, I don't think I can. So anyway, that happened.
Mm-hmm.
ROH though still existed. They got a TV deal on HDNet. What was HDNet? I've never heard of this.
It was just a channel. It was one of the, believe it or not, one of the first HD channels. I think that was its gimmick because it was the HD network.
Right.
This is, I have a funny story. This is when they came like full bore onto our cable system and like kind of took over. But what made me really like them is it was a Bucks match, and I'll never forget it. Nick Jackson got backdropped over the top rope to the floor, and Matt, like on the ring apron, it's like he went, "Nick, are you okay?" And he's like, been better. And like the whole crowd started laughing, and I was like, wait, that's not normal, but that was hilarious. And then I was like, oh, these guys are a comedy act, they're gonna lose, like, but they're really good at what they do. But no, they won the match and they were like really athletic, and I was like, who are these guys? These are amazing. These guys are amazing and they're hilarious. And then it was the Bucks. But that was my like first introduction to them. And then just from that first year on HDNet is for my first time seeing Okada, first time seeing Omega, Bullet Club, and that was the game changer. I was like, oh, okay, this exists.
So when ROH got bought out by Sinclair, did it change? Like, did they commercialize it more? Did they make it different?
They changed the logo a little bit, obviously, and they did their production was better. Let's start with there. Their production was better, and I'm going to go out on a limb. I don't know if this is true. I'm going to guess they also hired a producer, because backstage segments went from, oh, that was cool, to, oh, that was lit correctly. They used like correct camera direction, and like it got to that point. So
there was my problem now. Sometimes now, like, I'll want to watch an old ROH thing that I've heard about, and like early ROH it's kind of unwatchable.
Yeah, well, not in terms of like the TV, like the wrestling, just in terms of like how it was filmed and how it was lit. Like it's hard to watch a little bit. And 9 times out of 10, it was done by a fan. Like they had a lot of fan cam stuff,
right?
Because they didn't have money for actual cameramen.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of the early stuff is hard to watch. But yeah, once St. Clair came in and was probably like, okay, you can't just have Bill Smith sitting in the front row running around with the camera all night. It's like, so production went way up, but the wrestling stayed the same, obviously.
Yeah. Okay. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So this was 2011. By 2012 is kind of when things started picking up across the board. Okada, who had been in TNA and apparently had a terrible gimmick there, like they wasted him, came back to Japan, made that a huge deal. He became the Rainmaker, became the Okada that we know of today. Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks ended up wrestling a lot in PWG, and then eventually ended up wrestling in New Japan. New Japan changed their Tokyo Dome show to call it Wrestle Kingdom a few years earlier. So by 2011, Wrestle Kingdom was like established as their kind of WrestleMania. And in 2013, I think that this could be a J thing. 2013, someone named Prince Devitt started Bullet Club.
Yeah.
Want to talk about that?
Yeah, I just have in my notes here. I have Hard Eyes Mother Effer. So that was, gosh, that's 2013. So yeah, he I believe he was wrestling prior to that in Ireland in the IWC or whatever it was called. It was a smaller ring circuit, obviously, and he was pretty popular there. He was really good. And he's a very, small, agile guy, and he went to Japan and fit in quite well. Made a big name for himself as a heel, did the Bullet Club. He kind of started that whole thing, and it was because, let me try to remember here. So because in Japan, guns are outlawed, unlike here in America or, other places.
Pretty sure not having a gun is outlawed in America.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So that was the whole gimmick with he was, the shooter and like all that stuff. And that was kind of their gimmick. And I believe that was with, prior to Omega. Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. Sorry. Didn't do all of my homework. It was before the Bucks. It was, Tonga Tama and some other guy, the other two guys from WWE. I'm sorry, my brain just like kind of good on me. They were all in the stable together, and that kind of really took
Gallows and
off.
Anderson?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
they didn't have
yeah.
that yet.
And that really took off. And then after that was AJ and then Kenny Omega, I believe, as their leaders. And then it kind of like evolved. And then that led into like the being the elite. And that's when I think when Kenny was involved is when the Bullet Club like really picked up in popularity, and you could get like a Bullet Club t-shirt, and like, I mean, they had all kinds of merchandise. That was when that all kind of took off.
And according to this, what I looked up, it was around 2013 when ROH started partnering with New Japan, and I feel like that became a thing. That's where it kind of spread over to here, to North America, was when you could see this stuff happening in ROH, as opposed to having to watch a show at 3 a.m. from Japan. And yeah, I remember there's a story. I mean, the second part of this, we'll talk more about Bullet Club, because Bullet Club was, and obviously the Elite was kind of why AEW is a company. But I've heard a story that some executives from Hot Topic. That's how they ended up at Hot Topic. Some executives from Hot Topic were at a WWE show and saw a bunch of people wearing Bullet Club stuff, and was like, "Oh, that's really cool. We want that in our stores." And they had to tell them that wasn't them, and it was another company. And then they were like, "Oh, well, we're going to find who did that." And that's how they ended up there.
Wasn't that like the Mania or the Royal Rumble where Cody was running around? And do you know what I'm talking about? There was like a Mania Royal Rumble. Cody and the Bucks were running around, and they had like a megaphone.
Oh yeah, I remember that happened. I think this is before
like,
that.
we're here to rescue our friends. And
yeah, I think this was before that.
Oh, okay.
And so this is like maybe a year before that. And but that got them, the Bucks, the cease and desist stuff, didn't it? When they were doing the two suits. That got them that. So yeah, that's going to be our second part. So we're going to leave it there as a teaser for the second part. Is Bullet Club, the Elite, Cody, the Bucks, Kenny Omega, all that stuff. That's coming up in part 2. Hope you enjoyed part 1. We enjoyed it. I like learning all this stuff. I like reading all this stuff. So yeah.
And
anyone have anything else to say?
Part 3 will just be about Cody's promos in AEW. That's all it'll be. That's all.
That's sledgehammer.
No.
Just
We'll have an entire episode about the time
my
when they announced the gender of their baby and
Yeah.
had pyro.
Why doesn't anyone like us? I don't get it.
Poor Cody.
I know that Cody's very successful and well loved now, but for all the people who were just like, how did AEW not? Because he sucked in AEW.
He was
Yeah.
awful.
Yeah, he was
the worst.
Maybe the first
Ew.
6 months of AEW he was good. The last year, really bad. Like,
I just watched the Anthony Ogogo segment. Poor Anthony
Yeah.
Ogogo.
Oh, that guy.
he
Forgot
never
about
recovered.
him.
He honestly never recovered.
He's in Shane Taylor
Oh.
Promotions now. Come on.
He never recovered.
I mean, he made it work for him, but oof.
But yeah, we've got another couple parts. We have next week is going to be Bullet Club and the Elite, and then we're going to get the road to the original All In, and then what started AEW. So we had to talk about WWE. We had to talk about the other companies, because that's a real big reason why AEW is here. If the
100%.
world was super happy with WWE and loved it and didn't want any other wrestling, there would be no other wrestling. They would just be happy watching what they got, right? So
Don't worry, people. These two nerds have covered it.
we have.
You are now wonderfully informed.
And if for some reason you're a young person listening to this, you've now learned about VHS recordings,
100%.
torrenting shows,
Yes,
antennas, MySpace. We didn't stick in a landline anywhere, but we probably could have.
AOL
True.
Instant Messenger.
That's right. I found out that Bret Hart was leaving WWF from the newspaper. So there you go.
What?
that's crazy.
Actual physical paper?
Yeah.
Newsprint.
Whoa.
That's
Yeah.
unreal.
That's
So-
how it used to be, you little jags.
So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back for part 2 pretty soon. Bye.
Later.